Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 8, and we're going to be looking at the axial skeleton. Parts of the axial skeleton are made up of the skull, the vertebral column, the thoracic cage, and the facial bones. We're going to be looking at the skull today as our starting point. This view is actually showing the axial skeleton highlighted in that light green color, and the grayish coloration is for the appendicular skeleton, which we'll get to in further PowerPoint presentations. Just to take a look ahead, the appendicular skeleton will contain the upper and lower pectoral and pelvic girdles, which will contain the bones of our limbs, our upper extremities and our lower extremities. And this view is just highlighting in green the appendicular skeleton, which we'll cover in a future PowerPoint. This is just a quick little table which lists out the axial and appendicular skeletal bones, so you can see how many we have in the human body. Our total bone count is usually 206 bones. For the skull, there are 22 bones that are either cranial or facial in orientation. It's really important when you're looking at the skull and the facial bones to figure out the orientation that you're looking at. So for instance, on this view right here, we see that we are looking at the underside of the skull, the inferior view. This view is the anatomical position, so we're looking at the anterior aspect of it. And when we rotate that skull towards the right, we would be in this view here, which is the right lateral side of the skull and facial bones. This particular view is showing you the posterior aspect. This is showing you the superior aspect if somebody were looking down onto the top of your head. And then this view is actually the mid-sagittal plane, and it's really interesting because it does show the inside of the skull as well as the midline structures, the single midline structures that we would see. So for instance, we would see part of the ethmoid bone here and part of the vomer here, which the ethmoid has a centerline structure which we will discuss in future slides called the perpendicular plate, and the vomer is the centerline bone of the lower nasal cavity. Now with this view, we've taken off the skull cap, and what we're seeing is the inside of the skull from a superior to inferior view, and it's really interesting because we can see the sphenoid bone through here, which is a nice kind of a cross brace for the brain, so the sides of the skulls are kind of stabilized by the wings of the sphenoid bone. We also see the Turkish saddle, the sella turcica, which is where the pituitary gland is going to sit. And we see the inward jutting of the temporal bones on either side. So it's really very interesting to see this open skull cross-section. The skull also includes 14 facial bones. We'll be going over the actual features and structures of those facial bones in part 2, but the next slide will list them out so that you can kind of get a starting point for learning the names. The 14 facial bones do include the bones listed below here, which we see bones that are paired means that they have two bones, one on the right and one on the left. Then we also have unpaired bones, meaning there's only one representation of that bone. So we see the vomer and the mandible are only found on one side, or there's only one of them. It's a better way to say it. Before we get into the frontal bone anatomy, the specifics of it, just want to give you a quick look at some of the interesting parts of the skull, which include the eye orbits. Now, if you look deep into the eye orbit, which we can see over here, there's several bones that are knit together to create that actual circular eye orbit, and we'll see different landmarks associated. They're highlighted here as well as others, so it's just an interesting look at the inside of the eye orbit. We can also revisit the views of the skull. From the superior view, we see that this highlighted area is the frontal bone, and then we have one frontal bone, and then on either side we have the parietal bone, which makes up basically the sides of our heads for the most part, and the back part of our head, the little curved area at the back, is made up of the occipital bone. Again, this is a superior view, and then we can see the little zigzaggedy lines that we have going down between the different areas. This one is pointing out the coronal suture, which separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. Then we have have the sagittal suture, which separates the parietal bones from each other. So we have the right and left parietal bones. And then at the very back, between the parietal bones and the occipital bone, we have the lambdoid suture. And we also see in this view, this little bone that seems to be a little island in the center, that is called a sutural bone or a Wormian bone. Now this is a posterior view that we're looking at, and again you can see in this lambdoid suture that there are several Wormian or sutural bones present. We can also see on the back side of the occiput this little knobby protuberance, and that's called the external occipital protuberance, which is basically a landmark for us when we're feeling the skull and looking for things on it. Other skull bones that we'll look at in particular are the temporal bone, highlighted here. Then we'll look at the lacrimal bone. The zygomatic is a facial bone. We'll look at the parietal bone as well. Now on this lateral view, what we're seeing here highlighted in green is the zygomatic arch, which is made up of one of the cranial bones, the temporal bone, and the zygomatic bone, which is a facial bone. And we're looking at the inferior view here, and we can see that zygomatic arch present. And again, this is just showing the two particular pieces that make up that zygomatic arch. So it's made up of cranial and facial bones. Now the temporal bone is one of the bones that we're going to look at, specific landmarks of it. We see the squamous portion. Squamous means flat, and this area is a very flat area of the temporal bone. It also forms the squamosal suture, so it's a nice way to remember it. And then if we look down here, there's a downward projection. That downward projection we see over here as well is called the mastoid process. And then there's actually a little hole, and that's actually your external acoustic meatus, which is where your ear canal is located. We'll get to each of the cranial bones in their own right, but this is an interesting cross-section that shows you the frontal sinuses of the frontal bone. The parietal bone doesn't really have too many landmarks. The temporal bone has more landmarks. The sphenoid bone is a really nice bone on this view because not only does it show the sphenoidal sinuses, which are found only in the cross section, it also shows the sella turcica, which is where the pituitary gland would sit. This view is also really nice to show the centerline structures. This particular centerline structure is called the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and it makes up the superior part of your nasal septum. And then it is joined by the vomer, which is a singular bone in the face, which is making up the inferior portion of the nasal septum. Now on this inferior view, we get to see part of the sphenoid bone projecting downward in the form of the medial pterygoid plate and the lateral pterygoid plate. We can also see the vomer demonstrated right through here, and we see some openings. Now these openings are foramen, okay, and that allows for blood vessels to travel through. So we have the jugular foramen and the carotid canal, both of which are holes that allow our blood vessels to travel through. Just a few more points of interest on the inferior skull. There's a downward projection that looks like a little stylus from the temporal bone, which we call the styloid process. We see this big hole here, which is called the foramen magnum. That's where part of your brainstem and spinal cord project through. And then on either side of that foramen magnum, we have this smooth C-shaped area, and those are called the occipital condyles. That's the area where your first cervical vertebra will actually articulate or touch the skull bones. And then there's some more openings or foramens which allow blood vessels or nerves to travel through. And again, just a quick look at the inside structures of the skull. We see the cribriform plate, which is part of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is in this region right here, and it'll articulate with the sphenoid bone, which is in this region right here. Okay, which we see drawn there, and then the different landmarks associated with them. Again, from our aerial view, we see the temporal bone as it projects inwardly to create a nice little cradle for the brain, as well as allow its structures to go internally. And then we also have the occipital bone. So of the skull bones, we have 8 bones that make up the cranial bones. And we're going to start off with the frontal bone first and find 3 landmarks: the frontal squama, the supraorbital margin, and the supraorbital foramen or notch. Now this view gives you a much better look at the supraorbital foramen, and you can see the actual hole there versus the notched out area. Now normally you would either have a supraorbital foramen or a notch, not usually both, but sometimes there are anomalies for individuals in their skulls. And you can see this notch is almost connected, which had it connected it would be the supraorbital foramen. So you can see labeled on this slide, in this flattened out area here, this is the frontal squama, and so that would be the flat part of your forehead, for lack of a better description. We can also see the supraorbital foramen or supraorbital notch. Now this area right here is showing you kind of a chinked out area. That is actually more accurately called the supraorbital notch. If there was a full and complete hole, so if the border of this bone connected over, creating a hole there, then that would be the supraorbital foramen. We also see the top of the area here where the brow would fit on your eye is the supraorbital margin. Okay, so it's kind of what makes the brow crease. Now on this particular view, you do not see a distinct notch or a frame, and you kind of have an essence of where it would be. You can see the supraorbital margin up through here as well as in this area here, and this would be the frontal squama, the region of the frontal squama. So each of our skull models might be slightly different from the other, so just make sure that you're looking at different skull models so that you're aware of the landmarks. The parietal bones will be easy as long as we're looking at them in the articulated state, meaning that they're put together, versus the disarticulated ones. So for your lab exam, you'll just need to identify whether it's left or right parietal bone, and that should be easy when you're looking at the skull as a whole. This is giving you a look of the parietal bones in its articulated state with the rest of the skull bones, and this is a disarticulated. Again, this would be the right parietal bone, and this also would be the right parietal bone, but in the disarticulated state, I will not ask you right versus left. The temporal bone will have a longer list of needs to know, so make sure that you find each one. We can see them here on this pictorial from the book, and on the next slide we'll see what it looks like on the bones. Now looking at the temporal bone, again, we can see the squamosal portion here, which also forms the squamosal suture, and we can see some holes, the external auditory meatus found right here. We can see a piece that projects forward. This is going to be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. We see this area that protrudes downward like a little point or stylus. We see it on this view as well. That's going to be the styloid process. We can see this little area here, this little curved area. This area is going to be called the mandibular fossa, and that is where the mandible will insert. And that is what forms your jaw joint, your TMJ. So in this view, we're actually looking at the left temporal bone. It's the disarticulated view, meaning it's not together with the rest of the skull bones, and we see the areas that are labeled the squamous portion or part. That's the flat area. Then we have this downward projection. This actually would be right behind the back of your ear, and that's the mastoid process. And then just anterior and inferior to that, there's a little downward sticky outy projection. That's the styloid process of the temporal bone. Now this is going to be actually a hole which projects inward, and that forms the ear canal or the external auditory meatus. And just in front of that, if you were to stick your finger in your ear, you would feel, if you put the next finger down in front of it, you would feel kind of a bulby type bone that fits into this area right here. Now this area is called the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, and the jaw or the mandible would actually fit into that area there. So I'm just going to draw you a little mandible so you can kind of see. It's not the best mandible, but your jaw would fit into here. And so this is the area here where people have TMJ dysfunction or popping or the jaw gets stuck when they eat too much bubble gum. And then this projection here actually is part of that zygomatic arch. That's called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And we'll show you more of these in the future slides. So again, you can see the mandibular fossa, this area right through here, and that's where the mandibular condyle will fit. We see the styloid process again, the mastoids repeated, as well as the squamous portion of the temporal. And again, just another quick addition, we see the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This is just a quick colorized version of the skull and the facial bones. It's kind of nice because it helps pick out the different bones by that color coding, so you can clearly see that the green bone here is the lacrimal bone. We can see that part of this yellowish orange bone is the maxilla, which projects upward into the medial aspect of the eye orbit, and we can see the zygomatic bone real clearly. In reality, though, our skulls are not color coded. I'm going to use this plain skull just to mark a couple of problematic areas that people have for remembering landmarks. Now this little rubberized area right here that we see, that area on the temporal bone side is called the mandibular fossa. From the mandibular side, this little rounded edge that fits in there is called the mandibular condyle. This one does not show very well the styloid process of the temporal bone, but it does show the mastoid process right through here. We can see on this back edge, this little protruding bump out area, the external occipital protuberance. We can see the squamosal suture, which we haven't gotten to officially, but we will. We could also see the sutures that are formed between the frontal bone and the parietal bone, the coronal suture. You can see part of the supraorbital margin. We can see some of the temporal process, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. We see that squamous portion of the temporal bone, as well as the external auditory meatus. Again, this view is just pointing out the zygomatic arch, which is made up of two processes, one of the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, where they knit together right through there. So on this view, what we're seeing is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone as it articulates with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone to form the zygomatic arch. One more look at our temporal bone from the aerial view, and we see the petrous portion that's projecting inward, and that's where our inner ear organs will be found. This is the disarticulated temporal bone, showing you the petrous portion as well. From the inferior view, we can see the jugular foramen and the carotid canal, both of which are formed by the temporal bone as it articulates up with the occipital bone. We can also see from the occipital bone the foramen magnum, which is the hole that allows the brain and spinal cord to exit the skull, and then we see the little bumpy, sticky outy spot, the external occipital protuberance. Let's look at the occipital bone very specifically. On the next couple of slides, we'll show you the different landmarks listed here. Just showing you the lateral view where you can see this bumpy, sticky outy area. That's called the external occipital protuberance. That can also be seen on the inferior view. And on the inside of the skull, the internal superior view, we would actually see an internal occipital protuberance, but we are not going to require you to know that for the lab exam. And then we see on either side of that big old hole, the foramen magnum, we have this smooth kind of C-shaped areas. This is an area for articulation or connection with the C1 lateral masses, and that's called the occipital condyles. So here we have our close-up of the occipital bone, and again I'm going to outline for you here the occipital condyles so you can see that they're smooth C-shaped areas of the occiput that will articulate with the first cervical vertebra, and that's where we have our yes and no motion come from. We see our foramen magnum, which is this nice big hole right there where the spinal cord and part of the brainstem can come out. And then we see in this area right here, this little bumpy area that sticks out, the external occipital protuberance. And here it is again with the arrows so that you can see a nice clear picture without my outlining. Again, we're going to look at some of the structures of the occipital bone, or occiput as it is also called. And this is from the inferior skull view, so everything's put together. We see some of the temporal bone foramen available here with the carotid canal and the jugular foramen. But we again see this foramen magnum, which means literally hole that is large. We see the occipital condyles that's present on right and left sides, and we see the external occipital protuberance again. Now, the sphenoid bone can seem a little intimidating because it does have a lot of landmarks, but we just take it step by step and you'll be able to see them relatively clearly. The biggest key for determining what landmark you're looking at is first to figure out what orientation that you are looking at the sphenoid in. So this is actually the posterior view. So if we were in the skull and looking forward, we would look out through these slits through here on the posterior view. This is a superior view, so we're looking down into the skull, and this is what we're seeing. This is the inferior view again, and again this is the lateral view, which you would kind of see along this edge, but a little bit more depth to it. Now, from this superior view, we can see the sphenoid again is outlined right about here, and this actually looks like, to me, the wings of a bird. Okay, it's actually the lesser wings of the sphenoid on either side, and then the greater wings are located beneath that, and you can see that it would help cup the beginning part of the temporal lobe of the brain. Now, there is just behind the wings, just posterior to it, this little area here, and it's actually like a little valley. From the side it looks like a little U shape, and that is called the sella turcica, or Turkish saddle in English. And basically it creates this little cupping area so that the pituitary gland can be housed in there. Now this is a superior view from your book. It's a little washed out. This area here is a little hard to see depth perception wise, but that is the area of the sella turcica. This would be the lesser wing on the right and the lesser wing on the left. This would be the greater wing and the greater wing on the other side. Again, just pointing out the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. Now we're adding in the greater wings that you can see on either side. One of the things we can see is this little slit-like opening from this particular view. That is part of the superior orbital fissure, which the sphenoid bone actually makes up the posterior aspect of the eye orbit. And as such, our eyes would be out here, and the eye nerve would travel through this optic canal, cross to the other side part of it, and travel back. The other eye would be over here, and its nerve would travel in, some of it would cross to the other side and back. So these holes that the optic nerve travels through are called the optic canals. And you can see on this view a little bit of the optic canals. They're a little bit from an aerial view, so you're only seeing little slits, but it is a nice rounded hole. And the fissure is not seen in this particular view, but up underneath this ledge right here, you would be able to see the superior orbital fissure. Again, just posterior to those optic canals, we see a little depressed area, which is not showing as well in this particular picture because of the depth perception of it, but the sella turcica would be right here, and what would fit in this area here would be the pituitary gland. And then just again another outlined area of the sella turcica. Now in this view we're actually looking at the anterior view of the sphenoid bone, and we see the superior orbital fissures are much more cleanly marked through here on either side. And we can still see these downward projections, which in general are called the pterygoid processes. We would have the medial pterygoid process on the midline side and the lateral pterygoid process on the lateral aspect. And you see over here where it's nice and smooth, so the eye would actually be fitted up against this because the sphenoid bone makes up the posterior portion of the eye orbit. And just revisiting those pterygoid processes, and they label them as plates when we get down to the medial or lateral. Either verbiage would be appropriate, so on your lab exam you can just give me pterygoid process. If you know the medial versus the lateral, that just gives you brownie points in my mind. Now on this inferior view, you could see the downward projection of these pterygoid processes. They actually serve as sites of attachment for the pterygoid muscles, which are muscles that help us chew. So the muscles that go to our jaw up to the sphenoid process, the sphenoid bone, they attach to the pterygoid processes. Now the ethmoid bone is a small little bone, but it's an important bone because it is the bone that allows nerve fibers from the olfactory nerve, which is our nerve for smell sensation, to travel from the brain and out into the nasal cavity. So this is what gives us our sense of smell. On this view, you can see several different ways that the ethmoid bone may be viewed. It could be viewed as part of the eye orbit, which we see a little bit towards the medial border of the eye, right through here. If we look up into the nasal cavity, we can see part of its perpendicular plate, which forms the superior portion of the nasal septum. If the skull cap was opened and we look down into the aerial view, the superior view, we could see part of the ethmoid bone as it projects upward, and this plate over here with all these little holes. Now this is the same superior view. The bone has been taken out of the skull, and we see this upward projection which comes out towards us from the screen. That's the crista galli. And then we also see this plate on either side that has the little holes in it. This is called the cribriform plate, and those holes are called the olfactory foramina or the cribriform foramina. This is where the olfactory nerve and bulb would lay down in this area, and it would send its projections down through those holes into the nasal cavity. Now, from the posterior view, we see the crista galli nice and clear. It's that sticking up projection right through there. And we see this downward projection, the perpendicular plate. You also see the superior and middle nasal conchae. This is a view of the ethmoid bone inside the skull, or in situ, the crista galli and the cribriform plate. This one does not show as well the cribriform foramina or the olfactory foramina, so we would use a picture that really clarified those holes so that you could label them. Just another view for you to look at. Now this is the lateral view of the ethmoid bone, and the biggest thing or landmark that you can pick up on is this upward projection of bone, this little blade of bone, and that is called the crista galli. The claim to fame for the crista galli is that part of the dural sinuses, the dura mater of the brain, actually attaches to this area. And so when people have an ethmoid fracture, if they were to have some sort of break, potentially the break of the ethmoid bone at the crista galli could cause a tear, which would allow cerebral spinal fluid to leak through the nose. And so that's why for following head trauma, you're always looking for a clear fluid to be coming out of one nostril versus both, as opposed to like a runny nose from allergies, when people have allergies or when they cry and their nose runs from both sides. This would be a singular side event, and that's usually going to be a warning sign or a red flag that there's a potential for a skull fracture and they're leaking cerebral spinal fluid. Again, just another look at the crista galli and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the middle nasal concha and the superior nasal concha. It's a little indistinguishable here, so I'm not going to ask about the middle nasal concha and superior nasal concha on the models. That'll be more of a multiple choice test question. All right, we're just going to finish up with the ethmoid bone by looking at one more view. It's a little bit more of a close-up shot up into the nasal cavity where we see the perpendicular plate as well as the right and left middle nasal concha. So we finished up with the cranial bones. On the next PowerPoint presentation, part 2 of the axial skeleton, we will be going over the bones of the face.